Welcome. This is James Gaillard, and this is my podcast, Orthos, Straight Talk. Sometimes we're talking about personal growth, sometimes it's about pastoral ministry, and sometimes it's public policy. But whatever we're talking about, the talk is straight. I hope today's show informs you, and I hope it inspires you. Good afternoon, evening, everyone. It's James Gaillard. Welcome to our podcast. We have some special guests on today. Super excited. One you already know, Richard Gurganus, the pastor of Church on the Rise. We've been friends for years.
Yes.
And so he's with us today. And Dr. Scott Hagan. He is at North Central University in Minneapolis. Is it actually in Minneapolis?
Yeah, we're inner city, right down there in Elliott Park, next to U.S. Bank Stadium.
Awesome. So welcome to the Impact Center. Welcome to Word Tabernacle Church and our podcast. Today we're going to be talking about turning anguish into action. Mm-hmm. And I heard you speak, Pastor Scott, Dr. Scott, and they really touched my heart. And immediately I thought, man, I want everybody to hear kind of this story. And so before you share that story and we enter into this conversation, Pastor Richard, kind of give us kind of an update. How do we get somebody like Scott Hagan here? How did all this come about? And then we'll kind of go from there.
Thank you, Pastor James. Good to see you. And I've known Scott for 13 years. We met in San Diego at a church planting event, became friends. As I said, he's been in my home. He watched the Super Bowl and Seattle played, laying on my floor, eating cookies, and I've been to his home in Sacramento. And through the years, we've become friends. And so from a distance, I watched my friend come to the epicenter of something that was affecting the whole world. And you know my heart. My heart is huge for unity, huge for racial reconciliation. It always has been. It's part of our DNA as a church. So when we began to work on Third Culture, a complementary thing that you're involved with me, just trying to deepen our local relationships, have conversations about how we can produce that in this volatile time. When Scott told this story, he was coming in October. Everything else had canceled, so I assumed he was going to cancel too. What you were coming for got canceled, the minister's retreat. He travels all over the place. But he said, no, we're still coming. And so I've heard him tell this story about 5 times this weekend. I heard him tell it over dinner to our staff. It doesn't get old. It's just one of those moments, and you said it well, where anguish, by the power of God, got turned into action. So when you told me last night, we're excited to share it. I'm excited just to be here and listen to it again. So it's good to see you. Good to hear Scott share his journey.
Yeah, so, and I got to tell you, you probably are the coolest college president I've ever met. So, so I was like, okay, he's college president too. So let's just start with a little bit about your journey and who you are. Obviously, this audience doesn't know you. So let's start there, and then let's move right on into your experience.
Just so appreciative of the invite, Pastor James, the facility, the staff I've interacted with. It's just nothing but excellent and a real culture of honor, and I just really appreciate just the invite. So long-standing friendship with Pastor Richard, preached at Church on the Rise many, many times. Made a big shift in my life 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I'd been a pastor for 38 years, but had been very involved in local colleges, taught as an adjunct professor at colleges pretty much my entire career. Got my master's degree in my mid-40s, kind of jumped into the PhD world, got accepted to USC, Pepperdine, and Gonzaga. And, Gonzaga had the best basketball team.
Right.
So, no, they
Second
had...
best.
They had the leading leadership studies PhD in the country. And so I dove in, and it wasn't an online course. So I was traveling for the last 5 years to Spokane to do my PhD work twice a month. So I just actually wrapped up my doctorate from Gonzaga in leadership studies. So in the middle of that program, I got a phone call. I actually got a phone call initially from a search firm when Oral Roberts University had an opening in the presidency several years ago, and it was kind of a shocking call. But I wasn't ready in my heart to make a shift. But I kind of want to be ready in my mid-50s. I felt something was shifting, and so I started my PhD program at Gonzaga while I was a pastor halfway through it. This great university that my daughter had graduated from in downtown Minneapolis. I thought it was one of the great hidden gems in America, this incubator of the inner city where mission and commerce, where scholarship and fire came together. This great school called and said, are you interested in the presidency? And so I let my name go through the process, about 120 candidates, down to 20, down to 4, and they offered me the role. And so in 2017, I became the 7th president in the 90-year history of North Central University in downtown. And we're not a university in a city. We're an inner city university, which is powerful, unique, and positioned us in a moment of human history this year.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because we refer to it as learning and burning, and so I get it. And so you take on this role, and then Minneapolis winds up literally on the front page of every newspaper in America, and you're probably going to do this anyway. But what was so telling for me is how you entered into this story, talking about your annual Christmas letter as a family. And so that is so rich. And the example, I'm huge on metaphors, examples, making it live, right? Yeah. Making the text live, making the situation live. You've done such a good job with that. So share the story with us.
I will. So first of all, back in the late 80s, when I was in my mid-20s, I planted my first church. It was called Harvest Church back in Elk Grove, California. Now, I'd grown up in a very traditional white setting my whole life. My parents obviously are white, and the churches I went to were predominantly white, but I played sports. And so some of my best friends were athletes, very young, in football, baseball, high school. And I would say even then I couldn't articulate because I didn't have the moral, ability, but I observed a contrast in something. And I think leadership is not about recognizing the presence of something. It's also about recognizing the absence of something. Jesus said, "Where are the 9?" Not just the one that was there. So I felt an absence, so I had no theology or a language for it. So very early in my life, just had an ease. I don't know what it was. It was God's preparation in my life for something. Then in the mid-'80s, reading my Bible, came across Revelation 7:9, every tribe and tongue in heaven. And I just jotted into my prayer journal, Lord, how come the church on earth doesn't look like the church in heaven? Lord, how can we become a church that looks like heaven? And I just wrote that down in the late 80s. When I planted the church, it was in my heart. And I really had that Acts 10 thing where Peter said God doesn't show favoritism, which is ridiculous because you've been a Christian, Spirit-filled for 10 years. Right. And just now you're saying God doesn't show favoritism. So it shows you how social conditioning trumps everything in our life. Our faith and how that upbringing dominates us and has to be deconstructed. Even for the most vibrant Christian, upbringing is so powerful in our life. So that began a passion for the church that looked like heaven. So back in the early 90s, throughout the 90s, before Promise Keepers, all of that, just had a couple really significant men in my life in our church that we wrestled through the OJ trial. We wrestled through a lot of things. That was all of my incubation in my life where I was testing feelings and theories. So all that to say, this thing that happened in Minneapolis was really almost natural to my narrative or my life in one sense. So back to the story. So every year at Christmas, our family does what most families do. We put together this cheap little Christmas letter on cheap stationery from Walgreens with a candy cane. So we usually send out about 300 of these. And we kind of have a routine. It's a big night. We have popcorn going, movies playing. Mom and I have typed the letter, and it talks about each of us in the family. We got it in the envelope. So that one time we were living in Michigan, early 2000s, and the kids were all playing over there. I had a daughter that was a junior in high school, son that was a 9th grader, 6th grader, 4th grader. And they're all playing, having a good time. And at some point, they usually meander over toward the table to glance at the letter. So we got about half of the letters in envelopes, stamped, addressed, family letter, picture, the whole bit. My daughter, who's a junior in high school, wanders over. She picks up the letter, and she's reading the letter. My wife and I are just stamping these letters and putting them in, and she goes, "Wow, this is really a great letter." She says, "Hey, maybe next year I can be in it."
Oh, man.
And I said, "What?" She goes, "We grabbed the letter. We talked about everybody but her."
Wow.
And of course, my wife and I, we threw each other under the bus. I said, "Well, that's Mom. No, he did it. We wanted our daughter to love the other one more." No, it wasn't me. It was her. And we're in this panic mode because we left our daughter out of the family story.
Wow.
And so we're standing there. We've invested maybe $150 into this project, but we've also, it's time, it's close to Christmas. I told my wife, can you imagine if we looked at our daughter and said, hey, sweetie, we've spent a lot of money on this. We've already got a lot of time invested in this. Next year, we'll give you an extra couple sentences. We'll get you in the story next year. People would think I was the worst father that ever lived.
Yeah.
The only solution was to immediately and with passion rip the letter up as fast as possible, throw away our investment, and start over. Because we have to tell the family story right. When people are left out of the family story, the wound, and I really think that's the reckoning in the United States right now, is that there's portions of our country that have been left out of the family story. We're telling it through a partial lens and partial vocabulary. And because of that, if we simply say, well, we got so much invested in the story, how do we deconstruct the story and tell it right? The only way that love can be communicated is literally, I don't mean tear the country up.
Sure.
I'm talking about heal the story. But let's take a big step back and let's tell the story anew. Let's write it well, excuse me, so that people who are central to the nation are not left out of the family story.
Right.
And my daughter, we laugh about it now, but it very much could have become a wound and a wedge for our entire adult life had we not handled that right.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're recording this on Columbus Day, and I'm seeing this huge segments of our population, in many situations are white, right, and conservative, are happy Columbus Day. Other segments of our society who are people of color and more liberal are saying Happy Indigenous People Day. Yeah. And so we see this dynamic even today with what's the right story, and did we get everybody at the table as it relates to the story? So I think it's so spot on in terms of how we communicate that. And so you're in this place now. You're college president, and things happen in things happen in Minneapolis. Tell us about that story.
So as you know, we've been in the COVID situation obviously since March. So our school had been put in distance learning, and so this is around Memorial Day, May 25th. I'm actually in Sacramento that day, home for that weekend to see my grandkids. I roll over in bed on Tuesday morning, and I look at my phone, and of course I'm on the West Coast, so I'm 2 hours behind, and I see an image of this white officer with his knee on the neck of a black man in Minneapolis. And within about 60 seconds, of reading the story, I said, Karen, if even half of this is accurate, we're in trouble. Because I'm not seeing any ambiguity. All these situations, everybody finds their little space of ambiguity. Was it a phone, a gun? Was it this or that? The way George Floyd died in broad daylight on a busy street being filmed, with the look on that officer's face, knowing he was being examined and not even flinching, it was a tipping point for even the most passive person in this conversation. They were startled by what they saw. So, of course, that lit the city and ultimately lit the nation and the planet aflame. So it happened on Chicago. We're right down the street on Chicago. It was near the campus. And so we quickly began monitoring. By that Tuesday night, the riots were starting at the Target parking lot, which that's my Target store I shop in. I live downtown. And then by Wednesday, Thursday, the city was burning. Lake Street was burning. Chicago was burning. People were dying. And I thought my own university was going to go up in flames in this process. And so I get a text on Friday night. And the text was from a staff member that was someone I've known for 25 years in Sacramento, who joined our staff in the Fine Arts Department. His name is Ellington Porter. His brother Takoy, and him are the Porter brothers, live in Sacramento. We hosted the MLK event for many years in Sacramento. I had one of the largest in America, the Sunday night gospel service and then the Monday march. Thousands of people attended these events. And so we were the executive committee putting on that event. So Ellington texts me, says, hey, Takoy works on with the National Action Network. They are working on the details with the Floyd family, and Takoy saying, would you be willing, can we host the funeral? The family wants to know, would North Central host the family gathering? And I remember sitting in I was a pastor for 38 years. I've opened up my church.
Sure.
Funerals are messy. Funerals are somewhat of an uncontrolled event. Eulogies are messy, but I've never turned anybody away.
Right.
Yep.
And so my inclination as a pastor in that moment, not a president, is what Elisha said when he found out the woman said, my husband's dead. They're selling the sons into servitude because of the debts. And Elisha says in 2 Kings 4, how can I help? Not how can I prophesy, how can I lead, but how can I help?
Yeah.
I also felt the Holy Spirit put in my heart the phrase table of healing, create a table of healing. And then I honestly felt like the Apostle Paul in Acts 19 and 20, where he comes back from his missionary journey and the city's as a riot going on. And the apostles asked Paul, can you shave your head, pay the vows, and go in the temple for 7 days? And we need to behave more like a Moses lover. These people think you hate Moses. And the conditions outside our little church board meeting here are going to subsume us. The external conditions are too great. Can you go do this to help calm the riot?
Right.
And I honestly felt like the Lord wanted me to step into, even with all the theater going on in our world politically, that Jesus wanted us in this space to help calm the riot for the city of Minneapolis. So all that's happening very fast, but I'm sitting in my apartment with my thumb on my phone going, what's on the other side of this yes or no? I'm going to write a 3-letter word or a 2-letter word.
Right.
Lord, what's on the other side of this step of faith?
Right.
I've got this little thing from you, table of healing. And I said, yes, we would be wide open. I need to check with my board chairman and all that because we're in COVID. How do we do this? And there's some protocols. But that yes right there set in motion things that I never saw coming to create a moment where anguish could become a kingdom action that would be felt really around the nation. And so it was initially just a small family funeral for the Floyd family to grieve. But then we began to find out over those next 48 hours, and we're really built for this. We hosted the Super Bowl. All of Homeland Security we had 1,100 law enforcement on our campus for 11 days for the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. We just hosted Texas Tech in the Final Four. So we're urban, we're inner city, but we're built for all of this. And we have capacity and knowledge of how to handle large events as an organization downtown, even though everything was kind of shuttered at that time.
Right.
So 100 of our staff volunteered to come in, 100 of our students. We have about 30% of our campus are students of color. They started to volunteer, and they said, whatever we need to do. And so it was like catching confetti with tweezers. It was happening very fast, Pastor, and you were really playing high-speed, three-dimensional chess, trying to say, because I knew I thought the Lord was shielding me somewhat from the political dynamics going on, and this is fundamentally helping a hurting family. It's about alleviating suffering, nothing more, nothing less, and letting the Lord bless that action to alleviate suffering in our community. So over those next 2 days, then we found out President Obama was coming, Vice President Pence was coming. They actually each the day before decided not to come because of the COVID, but we still had, everyone from Jesse Jackson to Martin Luther King Jr. was there, to Ludacris, Kevin Hart, Tyrese. I can go on and on. LeBron's plane couldn't get in. We had 450 come to this memorial. National senators, leaders came to grieve. And so it became really this global event. And we didn't even know the body was going to be in the auditorium till that morning. We thought the body would be at the Houston Memorial. So what happened is we prepared for this. The day before, I get a call from the team, Al Sharpton's team, and just saying, hey, we'd like you to pray the prayer of comfort. And at that point, I was not anticipating nor desiring to be part of the public. That wasn't why we were doing this. And I actually recommended 2 of our African-American staff, the person who directs our College of Business or Technology, and then also our dean of our graduate school, Dr. LaToya Burrell. But they said, we really feel like you're supposed to do this. And so I have hundreds of students of color at my school, and I've got many wonderful African-American faculty and staff that are looking at their president saying, okay, are you willing to step into this? And it really wasn't a question of that. I just didn't want to be perceived as inserting myself into the national moment for self-gain. I was aware of that perception that people might look at it like, oh, look at Scott. He's trying to be, all that. But you're in that moment. You say, okay, Lord. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So I wrote out a very simple prayer. And I was with our chancellor the day before, and our chancellor, Robin Wilkerson, who actually ended up being the host of the memorial, she said, we should start the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship at North Central University. And I was thinking, my pastor love for the Lord, like this would be a great way to stick a piece of rebar right in the devil's eye, turning evil to good, combating evil with good. Let's do the scholarship. But then I was home by myself. This is the night before, and I began to get concerned that people might perceive me as trying to make a bunch of money off the Floyd situation. And then I felt the Lord drop this idea in my heart, then challenge every university president in the United States to establish the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship so people can give to the college of their choice. And so I inserted that into my comments. So the funeral began. We didn't even know we were on the stage, to be honest. 1 minute beforehand, the security comes up and said the governor brought his wife, the mayor brought his wife. We have social distancing here in the auditorium. We need to move you and Robin to the platform. So I said, oh, now I'm on the platform of this event. And by then we knew CNN was covering it. Lester Holt is outside. We have the Today Show with all of their crew, the BBC, every major outlet in the world is lined up broadcasting all day long. NBC broadcast the entire day from Elliott Boulevard, right in front of our front doors of our chapel. So the whole world had descended upon there. So as the moment of the funeral began, we had thousands outside our university. There was estimated 30,000 at the intersection of Chicago and 14th. And we would come to find out that nearly 100 million people in that first hour checked in on the Floyd funeral on the television feed, and 2 billion around the world checked in on social media. It was the most in human history. So analytics companies have told us since analytics was started in 2007 or 8 on social media, it was the most checked in event on that day that they have record of.
Wow.
So the funeral begins. There sits Jesse Jackson, there's Martin Luther King, there's Kevin Hart, Ludacris. These people are sitting on the front row of my chapel, along with a lot of wonderful pastors flew in from both sides of the aisle. And again, Pence and President Obama were supposed to both, but they just couldn't get there because of COVID. So it didn't feel in any way it felt like a family funeral, to be honest. It did not feel like a political event, Pastor, and that was what we were kind of praying for. Find that space, that lane of pain. This is not politics. This is about pain right now. And so there was an opening song. I took the podium 5 minutes in, and I welcomed everybody there, and I said, before I pray, I want to announce the establishment of the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship at North Central University. There was a very strong applause. Then I said, but what I really want to say is I want to now challenge every university president in the United States to establish their own George Floyd Memorial Scholarship so we can empower a new generation of young Black Americans to take leadership in this nation. And when I said that, Pastor, if you were in the room, this thunderous standing ovation led by Ludacris and Kevin Hart and these guys and the politicians, the applause went on and on and on. So 5 minutes into this room that was filled with such anxiety, this anguish became a door forward into something beautiful, something more, something different, not a distraction from this moment, but a way forward. And I think that's where, as Christians, we're able to offer the power of generosity as healing agency. So this moment happened, and I prayed, and then the funeral unfolded. And when I stepped off the stage, I didn't know that appeal to the Floyd Scholarship was the #1 trending piece of social media information in the world. Every outlet in the world was trending president challenges every college president to this. We immediately begin to hear within 15 minutes from college presidents all over the United States. As we sit here today, Penn State, I could go on and on, University of Louisville, Memphis, Alabama, different universities, large and small, Yale University, have established University of Minnesota, the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship, and they all credit it to being inspired by the North Central University appeal. So it was quite a fascinating thing. The entire appeal was 1 minute and 12 seconds. My entire time behind the podium was 3 minutes and 40 seconds. But 1 minute and 12 seconds, and there's been over 50 million raised now in less than 3 months. We have our first full ride George Floyd Scholar at North Central University. Derek Bergen from outside Chicago is our young scholar, and we're creating a national network of the Floyd Scholars and creating a database for people to track them and hire them. And can you imagine Floyd's 3 kids are sitting there?
Yeah.
You know, the only thing I have from my dad is my dad lived a troubled life, and I have a laminated bookmark of his obituary. That's all I have. There's not a person who's ever came up to me and said, your dad changed my life. I love my dad. I honor my dad.
Sure.
But my dad was the product of his environment. He grew up as a Cherokee Indian in a reservation in Oklahoma, lived a very difficult life. And but I don't have anything from my dad. And he died when he was 64. These kids now, I just envision 20 years from now that a day won't go by, a week won't go by that someone will come up and say, I got to go to college because of your dad.
Yeah.
You know, the system failed George on that day, but God has redeemed the anguish, turned it into action, and through educational generosity brought a sense of healing. And from that moment in Minneapolis, from the moment the funeral happened, there was not another broken piece of glass. Now, we had a little uprising in the first week of September. There was a little uprising. A person took his life, and someone thought maybe that the police were involved. And so there was a very minor little thing that happened last month. But the city calmed, and it just gave them a way to think differently. And so it's the power of generosity. We can turn anguish into action if we can help exegete this moment as pastors and politicians. We have to exegete this moment spiritually and socially for our nation. And if we don't, people are going to just turn on it. But that's why we're leaders.
Yeah.
And that's how the Lord helps us say things and plants ideas through collaboration. Scholarship wasn't initially my idea.
Right.
My only idea was to expand it to all the presidents. So I don't want to take full credit for that.
So how do you, and I have so many questions that jump out at me around this. I know we have limited time, but how do you deal with the narrative or the potential narrative of naming a scholarship after a person where there's this perception of them being a criminal, or how do you deal with that perception?
Just taking it head on. So yes, there are people. Now I'm a college president. I'm always looking for ways to create scholarships for future students. So is this manipulative? No, I don't believe it is, and here's why. The George Floyd Scholarship is not a scholarship. In some people's eyes, why are you honoring a felon? Well, first of all, that's deeply upsetting to me. If you study Floyd's life, he was arrested 5 times in the 1990s. He committed armed robbery in 2007. Yes, he did do that with a group of guys. He was arrested in 2009 and spent 4.5 years in prison and did his time. For that, during that time in prison, he gave his heart to the Lord. Now, when he got out of prison, from 2009 to 2020, 11 years, that was his first conversation with a cop.
Wow.
So this whole narrative of him being a lifelong felon, I mean, he talked to probation officers.
Sure.
But 11 years. So this narrative of him being a lifelong felon, I said, first of all, is that how you walk up and talk to people at church? Is that how you, I said, one, he's your brother in the Lord. The Apostle Paul calls him a saint. His blood cried out from the ground the way that Abel's cried out, because it was a death with a larger amplification. And so it meant more. Every life is valuable, but for some reason the Lord shined a light on George Floyd's incomplete life in a way to humble us as a nation. But he's not a lifelong felon. Yes, he had fentanyl in his system, which is a painkiller. He was 6'6", 260, 270. It had back issues. Like 1,000 other people that have been in my church that have been taking OxyContin and fentanyl, which was a prescription drug. It was a pain killer. He wasn't selling them. He had them in his possession. I look at that differently. I work a lot with Teen Challenge, which is a wonderful rehabilitation. My wife's cousin started Teen Challenge, David Wilkerson. And I've had 1,000 George Floyds in my church. I know George Floyd. I love George Floyd. George has been in my church, in and out of my church. But his life was being honored in the scholarship, not as a reflection of achievement, but reflecting significance. George Floyd is a life of, like 9/11 was a significant moment. It just happens to have a person's name attached to it. And the whole purpose is, George is gone. I tell people, George isn't listening to what we're saying about him now getting a big head, or we're not enabling George Floyd.
Right.
We're not enabling future wrong behavior. We're resourcing young people so their life will not end up like George Floyd's life. That's the whole purpose of the scholarship. So it recognizes the significance of his life, that it opened up conversations for Christians about justice gaps that exist. Now, the whole world's talking about it, but the church needs to deeply reflect on its progress and its actions in the midst of an anguishing nation. And so I just think the Floyd Scholarship is powerful. I know people are upset, but I just kind of smile and say, Jesus, this is exactly what Jesus would do. He would choose the lowly and the forgotten and the incomplete, the Mephibosheths of this society.
Sure.
And let's turn the narrative and see the George Floyds that are going into college right now, finish college, and complete their desire to be a Supreme Court justice one day, which he told his second grade teacher.
Wow. That's a great story. And so I love the thought of exegeting not just the text, but exegeting our culture, because I don't think we have nearly enough conversation around that, and I think you're spot on. So let's bring it full circle now. I mean, we're sitting in Rocky Mount, two pastors from Rocky Mount, where who knows how many people around the country will hear this or see this. Let's talk about some practical ways that we can move from anguish to action. I mean, not every church is going to be in a position to establish a scholarship fund. Not every local college or community college can do that. What things are you seeing, or what ideas surface for you around how communities can begin this healing process in their own context?
Yeah. It's a great question. Pastor, would you like to maybe share a little bit?
No, I'm loving what you're saying, and I think God's going to have the last word on this. I believe we're in this consternation of talking, and I feel like too many people are shutting down to the conversations we're having right now. I think that's why this is so valuable, and we got to find a way forward. We will. I believe that. So I think we're not there yet. We're working through it. All the things we're talking about are valuable, and we've got to get comfortable talking through these things. And I really think it's coming, and it's slow. And as we have a phrase, when you're dealing with conflict, it's like you have to let the hot water run off the hose. When you're a kid, hold on, let it run off. Don't overreact to that. In my church, I'll just share this real quickly. We are, thank God, multicultural. I have met with countless African-American families. Tell me what you're feeling. And it's all over the place, but they just want to be heard.
Sure.
And I'm your pastor. It's an honor to be your pastor as a Caucasian. What are you feeling? What are you going through? I think our church should have even done that at a greater level. That's been a reflective for me as a pastor. Probably some of our African Americans have said, hey, I wish more of our members had just come to me, but I think things blew up so bad they missed that moment, and I'm not condemning them. That's my job as the leader. It's one of the reasons we're doing the supper night. Say, guys, we've got to do better. So this is exciting to me, and Scott, I hope we'll get some nuggets going forward. I'll just interject that.
Just real quickly, for me, it's just everything's happening so fast and fearfully right now that people are just afraid. It used to be like, hey, you would disqualify yourself with a bad strategy. Now, one sentence or even one syllable, you're toast. And so everybody is so paralyzed. So leaders have to emerge, because leaders are supposed to be more thoughtful. They're supposed to be in control of their emotions. Leaders have to be able to think twice, speak once, instead of speak twice, think once. And I think that leaders are not showing the way right now. I go back to John 4. This frames a lot of my behaviors. Going through Samaria. When you look at Judea and Galilee to the north, Judea to the south, Samaria was the heartland of the biblical geography at that time that Jesus was. And so it takes 3 days to go from Galilee to Judea. If you go through Samaria, it takes 6 days. If you take the Roman road, it circumvents it. And what united Romans and Jews was the avoidance of the Samaritan. The only thing that brought them together was, we're not going through the city. we're not going to go through Samaria. There had been, long-standing since, 722, the Assyrians attacking Samaria, the intermarriage of Jew and Assyrian. And when they came out of Babylonian captivity, they said, we don't want to be around the mixed blood people. So it was completely racial. And it became a racial vulgarity when they called Jesus, he has a demon and he's a Samaritan. So Samaritan was like the N-word in the New Testament. It was a racial vulgarity. So so that's the animus that had developed over 600 years in the making by the time Jesus says, I must go through Samaria. I'm going to go in a straight line. These business people, because time is money, they would waste time and lose money taking the roundabout freeway just to avoid face-to-face, eye-to-eye contact. So the disciples come with Jesus through. They're reluctant. They go in the city. They don't want to be in Samaria, so they walk away. Jesus meets the woman at the well. She says, Jews have no dealings with us. You don't put your Jewish lips on our Samaritan cup, and that whole powerful interaction. The disciples come back and say, whoa, he's talking to a woman. And the scripture says they thought it but didn't say it. It's a little secret, which means it's not what people say right now. It's what's in their heart. So it says they thought it but didn't say it. And then 9 months later, they come back to the same city, and they're not hospitable to Jesus. And what does James and John say? You want us to burn this place down? Because that's what was in their heart. We'll destroy this place. And Jesus says, you don't even know the spirit that's in you right now. That spirit right there to destroy the other, wherever that's coming from, and it was really 600 years in the making, but that's the healing that has to take place in our hearts that Jesus is after. Again, Peter had the same hang up for 10 years of his apostolic leadership life. He'd raised the dead, but he couldn't have a meal with a Gentile.
Right.
It's shocking how deep this goes, how swift it flows. But I believe the Holy Spirit is deconstructed. Now, here's the problem that you have as a pastor politician, that I have as a pastor president of institutions, is we are all about, we got to win the well. So I'm at that well talking to you. Now, as a white guy, I've always believed if I could win the well, I had won the day. And I've come to realize in my own reckoning, Pastor James, that's not true. I've had great relationships. I've been winning the well my whole life. Like, man, this person had a feeling about what we shouldn't be, and we become this wonderful connection. I thought that the power of our relationship was transcending the world in which they had to live. So because Sidney and Greg Williams and Richard, my buddies, we were so tight one-on-one in our homes with each other, the world that he lived in outside of that conversation, really I never thought twice about. I didn't think about the world, the institutions, the systems of his life, because I thought because we're so down, we're so good, that it just would win the day of his world. I've come to realize that's been the flaw in my approach, that I have to rethink there are deeper systemic things. There are cycles that we are still reproducing that are not yet broken, healed, dismantled. Now, as a Bible man, as a biblical leader, being able to stay focused on those biblical solutions to these cycles, because it's all confusing right now between my love for the Lord, the Word of God, dealing with people who don't know the Lord, and we're mixing solutions and we're just trying to figure our way. And I think that's why for the average person, they're trying to catch confetti with tweezers. It's happening so fast. They can't think through what they're going to say next, so we're just simply distancing ourselves one from another, and whatever. And I feel afraid at times that the progress has been lost. I'm trusting in God that it's not. That all of those moments at the well are going to matter still. But I am regrouping my own perspectives right now about things that have impacted my Black friends and family members. That were outside of that well, that are real. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and that's helpful. As I think about what the appeal that you put out around the scholarship, my mind goes to maybe Micah chapter 6, right? We what does the Lord require of thee, right? And really this whole statement of God's people caring so much more about personal sin and totally ignoring institutional or social sin. And when you made this appeal for a scholarship fund, you really were focusing in a very real way on institutional sin, saying, you know what, our institutions, every institution needs to have opportunity made available, for people that are within a certain construct. What opportunities do you feel like are perhaps available to us in the kingdom where we can figure out ways to address institutional sin and not just, you're divorced, or you got locked up for being a prostitute, and and to your point of me wearing both hats sometimes, pastor and a public official, I struggle with how we have a different standard on personal sin. A woman gets locked up for being a prostitute, but the guy who bought the services doesn't. He goes home to his wife, right? So we have this, I often say that particularly as African Americans, but I think this is a statement around people of certain levels of income, whether they're black, white, or other people of color, are not only sinners, but are also the most sinned against. Yeah. And so we spend a whole lot of time saying you have to get saved. We need to help you get saved from your sin. But then very little conversation about people that are sinning against that person that I love so much. And so what opportunities do you feel like are perhaps available for us as a nation? You've addressed an issue of institutional sin where you're like, hey, we can do this, and 50-some colleges have followed suit. Do you feel like there's some other opportunities available? Does anything jump out for you?
Yeah, I think I have one very specific one that has been a quiet burden. It's becoming more of a vocalized burden now in my life, something I noticed. But I will say this, part of the dilemma that leaders, men and women like us in our roles, is right now we're taking on the weight of the world. And none of us are designed to take on the weight of the world. And we have to be able to take on the weight of the moment. Mm-hmm. But the weight of the world, like, that's how do I solve thousands of years? How do it's just, we become overwhelmed and it's almost suffocating. So I have to take a step back, breathe, say, Lord, what do you want me to do? What's my contribution to this? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now I'm a pastor educator now. So what is my contribution? It's providing thoughtful, prophetic leadership, bold leadership, courageous leadership, learning how to be the only Christian in the room. And that's what we're training our students. Sometimes you're going to be the only Christian in the room that believes what you believe. Who are you going to become in that moment? Are we preparing you to be that person? So in my context, helping universities, first of all, but in a broader educational. The thing that has always irritated me is you put a kid in an urban school in this country. Facilities are 90 years old. The urinals are cracked with mold growing in them. The desks are broken. There's decay in that facility. You're telling me you put a kindergartner, a first and second grader in that facility, and then the kid 30 miles away in the suburbs is going to an elementary school nicer than my university. Everything smells fresh, is fresh. Everything's new, the texture, everything is brilliant and beautiful. You're telling me that kindergartner, first, second, and third is having an equal distribution of opportunity? See, social justice to me is not about the redistribution of suffering. It's about the equal distribution of opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so those kids in the discrepancy of education and how we fund education in the country, mm-hmm. how we fund educational buildings, facilities, and teachers, it's so the disparity between the city and the suburb is one of the worst models. And see, our generation, and I'll say ours because we're just 3 years apart. Mm-hmm. We figured out earlier that Pastor James was a freshman when I was a senior, so we'll just leave it at that.
We're the same age, right?
So together. Our generation was happy with defining the problem. Oh, we got a definition for this. This generation right now, they don't care about the definition. They said, why isn't it solved? So we drive them through, and our explanations for why we've been sitting on the sameness mm-hmm. in some of these areas is not acceptable to these millennials that are marching in the streets. They're looking at us like, get out of the way. I don't care for definitions. You did nothing to actually solve this. And I think the discrepancy, so for me personally, I'm very engaged in the educational disparity conversation in our cities. You know, we're in the inner city. We produce a lot of public school teachers in Minneapolis for the downtown schools. But just that question, why do we fund it this way through property tax values and bonds? It's a system that replicates a terrible educational disparity from ground zero. And so now there's not a sameness when it comes to education in this country. That's a big burden for me. And then also, of course, with it's not the police, it's the policing. And what are we training our police in the manuals on how to de-escalate situations? I think we need better officers with better critical thinking to de-escalate situations. And I think we need to readdress, because that officers are getting off on technicalities because you trained me to do this. So if this is how you train me to respond, how can you then hold me accountable for my response? Now, that's not true in all cases.
Sure.
But I think policing manuals need to be addressed nationally. And I also think, obviously, sentencing, how incarceration works. You know, we are very familiar with Teen Challenge, which is a world-class drug rehabilitation center, but they're primarily filled with white residents. So
Sure.
these residents have stood before judges. So the white kid gets rehab and the black kid gets time.
Yep.
So that is real. So that's where the sinned against. I think we absolutely can be in that space powerfully, Pastor.
So, and man, you're preaching my sermons. Like, you're really just communicating in my heart, because one of the things that I've been very prayerful about is because one of the things we don't talk a lot about is that African American Christians are amongst your most conservative human beings on the earth, right? So what is it going to take to start addressing those systemic problems that you addressed and others by bringing together the kingdom of God? Because right now what we have is we have two groups of conservatives, because I would argue African American Christians are very conservative. I know I certainly am. My congregation is. And, you know, we're going to fight super hard around issues of systemic inequity that exists in public education, in housing, in income inequity, those kinds of things. Our white counterparts, and I'm generalizing, but it's still pretty spot on, our white counterparts are going to have a Sunday a year where they do sanctity of life and protecting life in the womb. And they'll say to us, you know, will you also distribute the literature? Will you also do sanctity of life? And we're going to say 100% of the time, absolutely, we're going to do sanctity of life Sunday. But then when we come around and say, hey, you know, the suspension rate, the out-of-school suspension rate for African-American kids in Nash Rocky Mount schools is 8 times that of white kids. Can you come meet with the superintendent with me? 9 times out of 10, we're going to be like, I don't really touch that. So what is it going to take? You know, because I know if we came together as a kingdom body in support of all of life, whether that life was in the womb or that life was in the world, I believe even within God's kingdom, we could accomplish a significant amount of work. But I don't know how to get us there. So what are your thoughts around that? And I hope that question's making sense.
And I'm certainly not an expert in political science, but I will tell you this. I think the two-party system is always going to work in a counterproductive way for the hope and aspiration that you just so beautifully described. Because of the way our nation is settled into two things, and that's why this third culture thing. And I don't have a simple solution to this. I mean, I love the phraseology. I don't know if it's yours or you got it, but that kingdom independent is a powerful phrase.
Dr. Tony Evans.
Yes, because I've heard
I
Tony say it.
stole it from Tony Evans. I have to give credit where it's due.
I said, did Tony get that from Pastor James? Because I heard you say it, and this morning I heard Tony, his son, say it.
Yeah.
And then
That
Tony
was a test. You passed.
Yeah, Tony goes on and says what he said. You know, it was powerful. You know, I was reading this morning out of Joshua, and I think 10, and he says, Joshua sees that angel of the Lord come, and Joshua says, are you for us or against us? And he says, neither.
Yep.
And honestly, that's been my way I phrased it, that I'm neither of these things.
Right.
I'm trying to find a space that has been, there's a new war going on, and I'm trying to understand what's happening. Remember the Apostle Paul, Acts 16, the woman comes up and says, these men are from the Most High God. And then it says after many days, he cast a spirit out of her. Like, it's weird. Like, she was saying the right thing. Why did it take several days? Because in leadership, sometimes it takes a minute to figure out what's going on here. We don't know it like this. Sometimes it's like you're trying to discern what's really happening in this moment, but it's going to take this, what we're doing. When I was a pastor a very large church in Michigan, about 5,000 people, my sons played football at a local high school called Granville. Well, all over the news, Creston High School, which was the black high school, was in the news because the coach wanted to drop the GPA requirement from 2.5 to 2.0 so his athletes could stay eligible. So it was all over the news.
Sure.
And of course, the narrative is what you're jumping already ahead to here. So my sons played in that league for Granville High School, which was marginally integrated. I would say 90% of the football team was white, and then there was Jenison, Rockford, all these other schools. So on Sunday morning, I get up there. My wife said she was sweating. Her hands were sweating. She goes, "Oh, no, don't do this." She knew what I was going to do. I said, "Hey, how many of you have been following the story of Creston High School and the football coach and, you know, that our top urban inner city school wanting to lower the GPA from, no, it was 3.0. He wanted to lower it to 2.5 to play football at Creston. And with the school board, how many have been following that story?" And everybody put their hands up. Thousands of people following the story. And I said, you're sitting there watching that, just kind of makes you think what? And just makes you think like, man, we're just accommodating those inner city kids again academically to stay, because those inner city kids can't do what we're doing. That's what's going through your mind, friends. As you know, my boy plays quarterback at Granville High School. My other son's a running back. I said, "Do you know what the GPA to play at those schools are? Jenison, Rockford, Granville? It's 1.75.
Wow.
Hello.
Wow.
If Creston lowers it to 2.5, it's still the highest standard in the state of Michigan."
Wow.
He's just saying the gap is so great, he still will have the highest standard in the league and the highest standard in the state of Michigan at 2.5, because our boys play with 1.75. And if we had the standard of Creston High School, about half that football team wouldn't be playing.
Wow.
So before we jump to conclusions and finish the narrative, and so people in the church began to not answer my questions, like, "Well, I'm not answering your question because this guy's setting me up." But what I'm saying, you've got to pick a moment to help unveil. Now, I will say this. I don't want to talk too long, but this is very, very short. Slavery is the abyss. The practice of the founders who inherited the European system and brought it to this nation that was not congruent with the aspirations of the founding documents was the practice of the founders of this new land. Slavery, its practice, which America has pretty much done this throughout and it was proven with slavery, we perfected the industry. I mean, we took slavery to a level it had never been, the way we take technology. So it really was the American way. We perfected the art and trade of slavery, but it's the abyss. It's like a man, Pastor, that has molested his daughter. And now that man's in your office, and you're the pastor, and you got to help this man understand what's happened. It's like driving to the edge of the Grand Canyon, parking your car. You don't get out of the car and run as fast as you can to the abyss, to the edge. You'll lose your equilibrium. You could literally fall. When you walk up to the Grand Canyon, because the disorientation is so great, you almost zigzag, and you glance at it, then you glance back at the person. You glance at it, then you glance back. It's the only way to reconcile the abyss. And I think for America right now, there's part of this country that wants to run people as fast as possible right to the lip of the abyss or the molestation of humanity that came through slavery. And there's others that understand right now, I think the Lord is helping us walk. You glance at what the history actually was, but then you got to glance back, because your mind cannot bear the weight of the abyss. And we're bringing healing to people. Now, some people want nothing to do with even talking about that abyss and the ramifications of that behavior. But we as leaders, we've got to be bold enough, because we're healing agents in Christ, to help people understand as a society and as an individual, how do I reconcile the practice of the abyss? And I think it's happening, though it feels tumultuous right now. But I do have hope in my heart. I'm not living disappointed every day. I speak aspirationally. I speak with grace. I speak with hope. I love these friendships.
Yeah.
And so I'm hopeful, but I'm also sober in this
Sure.
moment.
Yeah, that's a good word. And so as we end, I do want you to, Pastor Richard, make sure everybody understands third culture. And what it is, and then none of this conversation was scripted, but I'm going to always like to close with two questions. And so I'll give you both while you're explaining third culture. Your other part of your brain could be thinking about the answer, and then Scott can come up with his answer. But I want you to give us a book recommendation and a person to be on the lookout for. Somebody that you're like, you know what? I think, and it could be somebody locally, somebody nationally, somebody maybe we've never heard of. But book recommendation and a person to be on the lookout for. But first, tell us about third culture so everybody knows.
Thank you, James. Well, third culture started inside of me after the last mayor's election that was so contentious. I just woke up again saying, we've got to fix this. We've got to go forward for Rocky Mountain to be great. As you know, I'm just a big advocate. The greatest thing about Rocky Mountain is the people. That's what I always say. It's a great community, and we just had to make some progress. So when you work on racial things, one of your passions, it's exhausting, you know. Even as we're talking about this, it's stressful because it's just so many different. But I began to, you're one of the first guys I talked to, and you have sent me other names. And my heart was, I think one thing I have learned is not creating a culture that denies our individual cultures. It's coming together. It's a collaboration. Appreciate African Americans, appreciate whites, come together, understanding to be a great city. So as I began to talk to different leaders, I didn't want it to be exclusively Christian, but the foundation Christian. That's why the diversity last night is there. And for me, it starts with winning the well, as Scott said, but it doesn't end there. I'm a winning the well kind of guy. I'm relational. So that's where it started, and formed these 4 frames that it's all fluid, but I want to do some worship together. You and I have experienced powerful, things. You need symbolic things. That alone won't change it. But those things, like George Floyd, can just pivot you to a better place. Spiritual movement is huge. We want to do some projects together. And November 8th, I'll just plug this, we're doing a supper night, and we're asking, and people are coming in afterwards. It was a good buzz last night afterwards. It's like God say, now in your church, you don't judge the health of your church by how many people were there before. You judge it by how long they hang out after. That means they love each other. So I could feel in my spirit something good happened tonight. And Keisha and other ones were saying, get me the information on November 8th. I think this is powerful. So that's, and this is my guy to watch is Scott. And I mean that sincerely. We're in the car, and my wife, and I'll get a little emotional because she said, honey, God created Scott for this moment. And we're not super, super close, but again, I feel like God is going to keep using this story for a pretty long period of time, not forever, but it is that anguish to action is what we need right now. And the thing that we've talked about a lot is Acts 21. We're all in that storm. I mean, Christians, non-Christians, and the soldiers, they're all, do you throw the tackle over? Do we throw the anchor down? But Paul is in the bottom of the boat with Jesus. And I just want to keep encouraging reflectiveness for Christians. Have conversations, but be quick to listen, slow to speak right now.
Sure.
This is going to take time. And you have to be patient right now. I believe in the end, God's going to have the last word. I'm very prayerful over the election. I don't know what's going to happen, but there's going to be some hot water that runs off that hose no matter what. But figuring out a way, like you said, to kingdom independent, to get, you're passionate about certain issues, I am. We've got to find that lane where they can all come into that biblical frame and work on it together. Come back to me on the book.
Okay.
I'm reading some good stuff right now. But yeah, I think Scott is one of those guys that just that Kairos moment came for him, and he gave the right response. So that's what's on my heart. Thank you.
And that's a good word. And what kept coming up for me is courageous leadership. So I do want to thank you, because I think that what you did modeled courageous leadership. And I think that it's something, and you referenced it several times in your conversation and have modeled it in your presidency. And I think that is something that for me this is my 20th year pastoring, 15th year here in Rocky Mount. And, I'm really interested, and maybe this is a book recommendation for somebody to write, but I do think that as pastors and as leaders in general, we need direction in how to live out real courageous leadership. Because it is very easy. I mean, quite frankly, for most of us, and a lot of people would disagree with me on this, but I think for a lot of us, most of what we do, a whole lot of other people could do 90% of what we do. The difference in that leader that God really, really uses in an exemplary way is that 10% nobody else can do, that is specifically assigned to their lot. And I think that other people, quite frankly, of that whole list of people that the university could have hired could probably do a decent job running the university. But given that 10% moment would have never been the response you had. And so I think that, helping all of us understand what real courageous leadership looks like, when to say yes, when to say no. I mean, to your point, I'm a text away from literally much of how I'm going to be remembered could be in this one text. So God, are you saying yes? Are you saying no? Helping other leaders know how to navigate that moment, I think is really powerful. And I think for you to have modeled it, I'm personally appreciative as a pastor. So thank you for that.
Pastor James, thank you for your kind words as well, Pastor Richard. I do want to give you a book and a person.
Okay.
My last kind of tie-off statement about the Floyd situation is, I think for me, the scholarship, hosting the funeral, but especially the scholarship, opened up a theological conversation for many people around the country. It was a pretty hot topic on social media with thousands of people in all denominations. Why would you give a scholarship for a felon? And which is an incorrect way of describing George Floyd. But it really came down to this. Is the kingdom of God about the prodigal, or is it about the prodigy? And I will always lean and invest in the stories of prodigals where elitists and self-righteous people believe they themselves are prodigies, and that the prodigal is. But George Floyd is a prodigal story, maybe not a prodigy, but that's what we do as kingdom people. That's where we lean. That's because that's who we are. We're all prodigals. And so the book would be, there's two books. One is called Plantation Jesus by Scott Welch. It's S-K-O-T Welch, W-E-L-C-H. He's out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Phenomenal book, Plantation Jesus. And then secondly is a new book by Dr. Antipas Harris, who's a very close friend. He heads up the Jake's Divinity School for T.D. Jakes, and we have a partnership with Jake's Divinity in North Central. But he wrote a book called Is Christianity a White Man's Religion? And it's an urban apologetic, which makes a very powerful case that the answer is no. But he deconstructs the false construct that says Christianity is a white man's religion. It's a profound book for your folks to read. And then the speaker, the leader, is a guy named Reggie Dabbs. Reggie Dabbs, D-A-B-B-S. Reggie is a graduate of North Central, powerful African-American leader in his mid-50s. He works with the NFL. He's probably the greatest preacher, I think, in the country, one of the 2 or 3 top communicators in the nation.
Reggie's been to Rocky Mount, I think, the public schools.
In the nation. I'd have him preach here as soon as you could. He's got a brand new book coming out on reconciliation.
Awesome.
He's dialed in, and he's a great voice. And he already is a very established leader, but I'm just trying to introduce some people kind of in a broader circle. Reggie Dabbs.
Yeah, I've got my book.
Go ahead.
Okay. Todd Bolzinger, Canoeing the Mountains. I just read this, and it's more for leaders. He says the 3 keys for leaders, I hope I can remember this: relational congruence. You have to have the right relationships around you. Technical competence. you've got to be qualified before people will follow you, before you open up your mouth and say things. But then the third one, it goes back to what we talk about, adaptive capacity. We don't even make a calendar past 6 months now because if you cannot adapt as a Christian leader in these times, you're dead. And so I think that helps us be in here 20 years because we have relational congruence. Hopefully we have technical confidence at this point, and that gives us credibility. But you can have all that if you don't have adaptive capacity right now as a leader. And I think that is technical, but also with current events. There's a sweet spot in there. There's a sacred dance between preaching and teaching the endless, timeless Word of God and being open to what's happening around you. And great leaders can find that space. They can find that groove where they're not overreacting to everything, but they're, in there. So Canoeing the Mountains, James, you got to read it.
Those are great. And to your point about, my recommendation would be two Harvard professors wrote a book, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. And it's to the point of, being technically competent, but sometimes you're handed something where it's not a technical challenge. It's not about, can I technically work my way out of this? I have to totally revamp my operation, which is very difficult, and I'll leave this for the younger pastors watching this. It's very difficult for us pastors because oftentimes we are the primary decision maker. And when you are in a season of adaptive leadership, you have to then move to a team, and you have to have collective IQ and lots of people kind of looking at an issue. And so my other book recommendation will probably be Essentialism. My staff and I just finished reading that, really just understanding what is absolutely necessary and essential for us to have, and really about managing our stewardship better. And so that's something that we've been trying to navigate through in this season. So Pastor Richard Gurganus, Church on the Rise, Dr. Scott Hagan, again, welcome to Rocky Mount. Thank you, Richard, for bringing him. Thank you for hanging out, having a conversation with us, and hope everyone enjoyed this.
Great. Loved every moment.
Thank you.